Week 17 of the fantasy football season, and it's most championships for most fantasy owners or semifinals, depending if your league plays a week 18. So here's a few running backs. Start sits this week. The first start, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. I know James Cook last week, it was a bad game for him, no doubt about it, at the Los Angeles Chargers, where he only had 5 fantasy points in PPR leagues. But this week here, a good matchup versus the New England Patriots. I think James Cook, he can find the running lanes. And they got to get him the ball a little bit more and passing the football as well, where he only had 1 reception in last week's ball game was James Cook. So after a bad week, and we know they're emphasizing the run way more as this Buffalo Bill team, he still had 20 carries in the victory at the Los Angeles Chargers. I think Cook bounces back, and he's a start. The next start, Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers. Aaron Jones, an impressive ball game, and I know it was at the Carolina Panthers, one of the worst run defenses in the league with the Panthers. But he went out there and he had a good performance. 21 carries, 127 yards. So this week, good matchup at the Minnesota Vikings. That don't stop anyone on the ground. So this week, you don't have to deal once again, obviously, with the cold Lambeau Field. Over there is Aaron Jones, and it's indoors at a team that he's owned throughout his career, playing them twice a season at the Minnesota Vikings. So it's good to see Jones healthy, going out there, put up points and put up yards. And this week, I like him again. Next star, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So they're going to lean on Etienne heavily in this game, because I don't know if Trevor Lawrence, once again, another week, another injury was for him at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with a right shoulder injury where he left the game late third quarter in that one. So this week, a good matchup line of Panthers. I give up the third most fantasy points to running backs on the season. I know Etienne, he had a bad ball game, only 6 fantasy points in PPR leagues it was for him. But this week, I think he goes out there, has a bounce-back performance, and especially if Lawrence is out, they're going to try to run the football a whole lot in this one. Next start, Bijan Robinson, Atlanta Falcons. This week, a great matchup for Bijan Robinson. So last week was a bounce-back performance, no doubt about it, for him in that home victory versus the Indianapolis Colts. And this week with the Chicago Bears, I know it's a cold field over there, Soldier Field in Chicago. This Bear defense has been playing better, no doubt about it. Week here, I think he goes out there and has another good performance. And we know he's one of the better receiving backs out of the backfield already in his rookie season, is Bijan. So coming off a nice game, over 15 fantasy points in PPR leagues. Once again, he goes out there and he's a solid start. Next start, Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. Jerome Ford's pretty much a guy that goes out there and scores a touchdown weekly for this Brown team of fantasy owners. I'm not saying he's going to go out there and put up monster games, but we've seen at least 9 or more fantasy points the last few weeks here for Ford. So Ford's an elusive back. He's got home run ability, and this Brown offense is really playing great football. Joe Flacco's rejuvenated this offense, and they're winning ball games. So this weekend, a decent matchup on paper with the Browns back at home versus the Jets. Give up 7th most rush yards to running backs on the season. Ford, once again, I would put him in the lineup. Next start, Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. And Derrick Henry, a lot of people thought he was totally washed up. And this season, we've seen some games where he didn't do much. And then you see games like last week where he goes out there and has a good performance. Week, a great matchup at the Houston Texans, a team he's obviously known throughout his career is Derrick Henry. So once again, indoor game, which is always a plus this late in the season. This Texan run defense hasn't been all that great over the last few weeks here. Like I mentioned, we saw Hunt and Jerome Ford find the end zone versus them. And this week, I think Henry once again goes out there, a team with a great track record he has versus, and has a nice game. And the final start, David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. So David Montgomery, it's been a solid first season for him in Detroit. And him and Jahmyr Gibbs, one of the best 1-2 combo backfields, in my opinion, in all the NFL. So Jahmyr Gibbs is more the explosive and big play type of back and passing downs back. And Montgomery's in between the tackles and goal line type of back. So this week here, tougher matchup versus a physical Cowboy defense. Gives up the 10th least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. But David Montgomery could catch the football out of the backfield a little bit. Like I said, a physical running back. And we've seen this Cowboy team at times this year have trouble against the run. So right now, playoff type atmosphere, 2 playoff teams going at it. And I think Montgomery has a good game in this one. Now to the sits, James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. So James Conner, it's been a mixed bag of results this season. And obviously he missed 4 weeks with injury as well. So James Conner, last week, his ball game once again with over 20 fantasy points in PPR league, showing his receiving prowess in that one was Conner, where he had 5 catches, 67 yards, and found the end zone. So this week here, tougher matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles. They give up the third least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. This week to go into Philly, tough environment, good run defense, one of the best lines in the league. And I know Connor's coming off of 3 great games in a row. It's tough to start him this week. Obviously, if you have no other options, you're going to put him in your starting lineup. Is James Conner. But this week, with the tough matchup and with this Philly team, I think focusing in a little bit more on the run, they're going to stop him this week. Next sit, Khalil Herbert of the Chicago Bears. I know Khalil Herbert, he had a nice game, 19 fantasy points in PPR last week, but this week a tough matchup for him as well versus the Atlanta Falcons that have been one of the best teams versus the run. We've seen it over the last few weeks. Not many running backs have done much. Khalil Herbert in this offense, they only play good football in the running game when they've had a lead, and then we saw last week versus the Arizona Cardinals. This spare team did have a lead, so this week here, I think Khalil Herbert, once again, isn't going to do much. I know last week was a great game, but since he returned from injury as well, besides last week's game, he's been a running back that's been middle of the pack to putting up poor numbers. Next sit, Devin Singletary of the Houston Texans. I know Singletary's, he had some pop ball games this season, but this week a tough matchup versus the Tennessee Titans. One of the best run defenses in the league, believe it or not. And the way teams have beat the Titans all season is throwing the football. So I expect C.J. Stroud back in this ball game for this Houston Texan team. They're hanging on the thread for their playoff hopes as well. And Tennessee, like I said, they can't stop the passing game, but they definitely have stopped the run this season. And we saw it once again last week where Kenneth Walker didn't do anything in that game. So this week, Devin Singletary is a sit. Next sit, Gus Edwards of the Baltimore Ravens. So Gus Edwards, he's been a running back pretty much touchdown and bust. It's been, I know Keaton Mitchell out for the season, but Gus Edwards, even this week in a tougher matchup versus the Dolphins, they give up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. I don't really see Gus Edwards doing much in this game. Like I said, if he hasn't found the end zone this season, he's pretty much maxing out 7-8 fantasy points. So this week, once again, he's a sit. The next sit, Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The same as Gus Edwards, he's been a touchdown-dependent running back this season as Harris. I know last week, 78 rush yards and a touchdown in that one, in a nice victory versus Cincinnati Bengals. This week at Seattle, tougher environment, 12th man, obviously. And Harris this season, we know he's not really a receiver that's been catching the football out of the backfield. It's been Jaylen Warren, and he's a more explosive back. So this week at Seattle, he's a sit. Next sit, Kareem Hunt of the Cleveland Browns. So Kareem Hunt last week, he had 9.5 fantasy points. But if he didn't score that touchdown, he really didn't do anything at all. So Jerome Ford, the better running back over there. This week on paper, I know it's a decent matchup versus the New York Jets. But Kareem Hunt, in my opinion, his best days are behind him. The explosiveness isn't there. The burst isn't there. Believe it or not, this Brown team seems like it's been a pass-first team now over the last few weeks, especially last week. Amari Cooper having the monster game, going over 265 yards in that one, and finding the end zone twice. So he's a sit, and the final sitter this week's A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. So Dillon, yes, he did find the end zone in last week's game with the Carolina Panthers, but this week he's not really running back I could trust. I know it's a good matchup at the Vikings that give up the 8th most fantasy points to backs on the season, but A.J. Dillon obviously was out-touched by a lot in that one by Aaron Jones in last week's game versus the Panthers. And once again, Aaron Jones is going to be the bell cow. They saved him and sat him out a little bit longer that he could be healthy for the stretch run, even though I know the Packers most likely won't make the playoffs 7-8 on the season, but Aaron Jones looked healthy and looked ready to go. So this week, Dillon's more going to be a change of pace back and maybe short yardage at best. So he's a sits. That's running back start sits week 17 of the fantasy football season.